Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and you're listening to the Web Development 101 podcast. And yeah, I do these every periodically when I got tech that I want to talk about, and I got tech I want to talk about. The last few days I've been playing a lot with DockerCompose. Now I've talked about Docker before, and let's just kind of reiterate what Docker does. Because a lot of times people get confused with Docker containers and a virtual machine. So when you create a virtual machine using like a supervisor like VMware or something like that, what you're doing is you're really creating like a virtual computer. So it's not only are you allocating it resources like RAM, specific resources like RAM, hard drive space, etc., but it's also running its own kernel, okay? Which is sort of like that root of telling the operating, it's like that, it's a piece of software that basically says, okay, here's how the operating system communicates with the hardware. So you really are running sort of like a mini computer within, which sometimes that's what you need to do. What a Docker container does is more like it's more like a secluded file system in a sense. Like you're not necessarily creating another kernel. You're not necessarily allocating a specific amount of RAM or hard drive space per se. You're just creating sort of like this process that's kind of isolated, and has access to this sort of like walled off file system. And this is great because you create like a oftentimes if you're just installing something on your own computer, you might install Node, and then you install Homebrew, and then something you installed on Homebrew messes with files that relate to Node. And what happens at all these different installations, they edit different files, and then they break each other, or they create collisions with each other. So being able to kind of isolate the different things that are going on in your computer is really cool. So that's like the awesomeness of a Docker container. It doesn't quite have the same overhead as a virtual machine, because you're not necessarily, one container isn't supposed to be necessarily be your computer. It's really supposed to kind of like handle a thing you're doing. You could do multiple things. You could have one container that's running a Postgres server and a web server, but usually you kind of separate it out. And where Docker really shines is like deployment. Okay, so or creating dev environments. Really, you can use Docker for all sorts of things. So in the past, I've used Docker a lot for setting up like dev environments and deployment. So I've just used Docker. So for deployment, I use it mainly for like Deno, because in the early days of Deno, which Deno it's still technically in its early days. And if you're not familiar with what Deno is, it's like the alternative to Node. The people who made Node made this newer JavaScript runtime that's supposed to be sort of like, if we had created Node now, with all the changes that have happened since Node was released, this is what we would have come up with. It's created in Rust. It's really cool. It has like top level await, built-in TypeScript support. It's really cool. And they're bringing in like the ability to like compile the binaries and all sorts of really other cool stuff being built into the Deno runtime. But in the early days, it really wasn't like build packs or really a built-in way to like deploy Deno. So I was using Docker containers, and that's kind of like when I learned Docker. So what you would do is you'd take like a normal, like let's say Ubuntu image. So first you start off with like a blank Docker container that represents like your target operating system. So we'll just say like Ubuntu. And then what you can do is you create like a new image from that. You use that as your base image. So this thing represents sort of like a blank Ubuntu environment. And then what you do is you use a Docker file, and the Docker file gives you the recipe of how to create a new image based on your specifications. So I say, hey, start with this Ubuntu image, copy these files into the image, run these commands, and then make a new image based on the state of the container at the end of following all my commands. And now I have a new container that represents like that base container after like installing things like Deno, and then copying the files from my application, etc. And then you can even specify like an entry point command, which is like a command that runs whenever you turn on the container that would spin up your application. So that's really cool. But what if you want to containerize like multiple things? Do you want to containerize your, not just your app, but the database you're using, your reverse proxy server like an Nginx or Apache, and you want all these containers to talk to each other. This is where Docker Compose in. And the Docker Compose is something I've been kind of intimidated by for a while. But over the last few days, I've decided to like re-explore it because I had a client that wanted me to kind of set up the redeployment of their application as automated as possible. So I sat down and dug in, and it's really cool. And if you want to see kind of how to do that, I did put out a new tutorial in my blog on how to create an environment for like Express and Neo4j. Neo4j is a graph database. You might have used Postgres and SQL, a relational database. You might have used Mongo, a NoSQL database. Neo4j is sort of like the graph database, and it's really cool. That tutorial will walk you through sort of setting up the Docker container, setting up Docker Compose, even dabbling with like CQL, which is the Cypher query language, which is what Neo4j uses, and just the basics of using it, which is cool. So if you ever want to kind of try that out, and graph databases are really cool. I think I did a previous episode on graph databases recently, or at least one of the more recent episodes. But yeah, so I built that, and that was really cool. That was a lot of fun. And now we can get to Docker Compose. So what Docker Compose does is it allows you to orchestrate a network of these containers. So you can say, hey, I have this network, and this network is built of several services, and each service is a container. And you can specify like which containers depend on who, which means they can talk to each other. So basically, it's almost like having two computers on the same network. And they can kind of refer to each other in their URLs and such. You can specify different environmental variable files that different containers then have access to those environmental variables. It's pretty customizable, and it's all done through YAML files, and it's pretty straightforward. There's a few things that kind of took me an initial leap to kind of understand, like volumes. So initially in Docker, what you can do is you can map a volume when you run a container. You can say, okay, this folder in the container is the same as this folder on my computer. This way, like any files you save in the container or any data that's saved in the container within that file, that folder, will be on your computer. So that way when you shut off the container, those updates stick around. This is great for like databases, because you're writing data to a database, so you want to have that database exist longer than the container. And you can map to an existing folder, which is what I'm used to in Docker. But what I didn't realize is that you could just create named volumes. So like I always saw this like in Docker Compose files, and I really didn't understand how it worked. Like, how did it know where to save the files? How does it know which folder it's mapping to? So now I understand that if you create like a named volume, it just saves it inside your computer within like where Docker Compose is installed. It has like a place for volumes, and we'll just create a volume by the name you give it in your Docker Compose file. So you're not really mapping it to a particular folder. You're just saying, okay, hey, just create like an empty folder in here, and anytime this container runs, make sure you save the stuff in here. So that's cool. Makes it really easy to just kind of fire up a new volume, add multiple volumes, share volumes between containers. Really cool stuff. And I don't know if everyone finds like these DevOps-y type things as interesting as I do, but I always find like the ability to just sit there and say, hey, here's this cool structure, this cool setup, and being able to just like turn it on with the switch of a button. That's like really cool. So I'm probably going to be creating like many more sort of Docker Compose templates. So now I've created one with like Flask, Nginx, and Postgres, and I've created another one with Express and Neo4j. Debating whether to make one with like Fast API and maybe see if I can make one with Go. I just kind of find the one, just kind of getting it all arranged. You learn a lot of things about the technologies you're trying to coordinate. So it's pretty educational in the process. And it really just kind of helps you really understand like orchestrating like how all these things connect to each other better, because you're literally designing sort of like how they would connect to each other across several computers, but on one machine, which is really cool. So I could just spin up a virtual like private server, a VPS, on a Linode or a DigitalOcean, and then just install Docker, clone my repo with my template, and just hit Docker Compose up build, and it'll literally just build this exact environment again. I don't have to like necessarily recreate it. That's like the beauty of it. So now that I've ranted and raved on Docker Compose, just a little heads up about like content I put out lately. I put out a lot of new videos on React, a few on Solid.js, but I think I made those Solid.js videos since my last episode, so I might have mentioned those in the last episode. But created some new videos on just the basics of React. I noticed that like I had a lot of React stuff, but not of it really spent like a good amount of time just kind of like, well, what is JSX, and just kind of really cementing those fundamentals. On top of that, I'm trying to think what other technologies have I played with lately. I mean, mainly I've been a lot of what like clients have like really been interested in is less like me developing applications for them more than developing like automations for them. So they might use platforms like Airtable, QuickBase, Google Docs, whatever. And the idea is that they want to kind of automate between all these platforms. They don't necessarily need their own platform, so a lot of this is like internal stuff. So again, for those of you who are aspiring devs who are thinking like, well, who are probably just thinking every job is just building applications, a lot of times it's building internal stuff. It's more like trying to automate their internal processes and trying to find ways that that their sales team can keep track of their clients, but their accounting team can then keep track of the payments and making sure that hey, when accounting is tracking payments, that the sales team knows right away what's been paid, so that way you don't have someone from the sales team knocking on a client's door saying, hey, have you paid this yet, when it's already been paid. Just trying to create these connections. And while a lot of platforms may have these things, maybe the accounting team is using like FreshBooks or something, but the sales team is using Salesforce, and they don't necessarily like automatically communicate with each other, and they may not automatically communicate with each other in the way that they need. So oftentimes, they may come to me, and I'll have to like learn the APIs for these platforms, and then create scripts in JavaScript, Python, whatever language, depending on what SDK they use, to kind of create those processes. So it's really important to have those sort of like that bird's eye view, and sort of just like not necessarily like the details, like you switch languages as needed, but what is the big picture? The idea here is like always thinking about sort of the user experience. Like a client says, here's what I need to happen, and not necessarily being stuck on how it has to be made, because at the end of the day, like even if the platform you're using, its own automation tools are limited, okay, they oftentimes have an API that allows you to kind of reach beyond. So thinking more about sort of what's the user experience, and thinking about like what are the necessary things to happen to make that happen correctly, that'll always think about the user experience first will help you identify what you need to do, instead of thinking what I need to do and then saying this is what the user experience has to be because this is how I'm going to do it. Okay, and that's how you end up with like apps that are like not very user friendly, because people just thought about the functionality first and how they're going to build that functionality without thinking through sort of like what the user experience should be. Like the user should come to the screen, click this button, and X should happen. Instead, they say, okay, well, I'm going to build something that does X, but because of the way I built it, now the user's going to have to click this button, fill out this form, then click that button, and then do the do-si-do. And you end up constructing a really poor user experience because you built the thing before you thought through sort of how the user's supposed to interact with the thing. So I just figured I'd put that out there. I being someone who also trains a lot of devs, noticing, like trying to always emphasize, like think about the user experience first. Same thing when like, you're just doing like design stuff. Like if I'm just like replicating a mock-up, I always think about sort of like, it's not just like, hey, I'm gonna go write some HTML. I think through like, what is the experience? What is like the thing? Like, what should I expect? Like, set your assumptions ahead of time about the end result. Work with the end in mind. But that means you have to kind of sit there and meditate on the end. That's why planning is important. Okay, just rushing in there and just starting to write code and whatnot isn't very helpful, because you don't know where you're going. And then you're just going to feel lost and feel like you hit a dead end. So always start with the end in mind, and then abstract until you kind of start getting into actionable like things you can do code-wise. And again, don't always assume that the answer is always code either. Oftentimes there are all sorts of tools. Like recently I was working with a company called Data Fetcher IO. They built this platform where you can like coordinate APIs between Airtable and well, pretty much any API you can think of. Um, and that's a perfectly good solution for a lot of problems that otherwise you would have to sit there and like learn the Airtable API and construct a script. And honestly, like probably most of the time, it'd probably be easier just to use Data Fetcher. Like, like if there's a tool that can do it that someone already built, use it. As a developer, the goal isn't for you to just to write the fanciest code just for the sake of writing code. Your job is to find solutions for your clients, for your employers, whatever, to produce the thing they asked you to produce, to create the experience that needs to be created, whether it's an experience for customers who are paying to use your application, whether it's internal teams who you're trying to automate so that way they can be more productive and sales teams can go make more sales and accounting teams can track and collect payments faster. Like, think about sort of like the why. Like, what is the solution that you're trying to create, and why is the solution needed? Like what? Like, you're not just building a thing to build the thing. You're building a thing because it's going to make someone's life better. And if you have that in mind, you will be a better developer. You will come up with better solutions because you're thinking more solution oriented, not code oriented. Code is just one tool in your tool belt. And then even in the world of tool, each language, each framework, each whatnot is a tool in your tool belt, and every tool is not necessarily is not the solve for everything. So don't think of yourself as like a React developer or a Vue developer or a JavaScript developer, because then you're pigeonholing yourself into what tools are available to you, and you're kind of telling yourself that you're not going to expand between that. Okay, I'm not going to hire someone who tells me that, hey, I'm going to work within a limited set of tools. Now, hey, if you have expertise within a certain set of tools, that's great to know. But I need to know that you're willing to be nimble and find solutions. Okay, and you want to look where you need to look to find the solutions that are needed to do the thing, because that's what matters at the end of the day. Clients, they're not coders. They don't care how you made it. They care that you made it. And they don't want to hear that, oh, well, within the tools that I've decided I'm going to use, I can't do the thing you want. You need to hire someone else who uses other tools. Well, it's like if I hire a plumber, and the plumber says, well, like, I don't have the parts. I'm not going to order the parts, so you're going to have to hire someone else. Here's my bill for services rendered. Like, that would be upsetting. Usually the plumber says, okay, well, you're going to need X, Y, and Z, and they go order the additional parts. They'll go get the additional pool tools. Now, those costs I will get billed for, but I will have a solution. So remember, you're being hired as a problem solver. Focus on solving problems. Focus on creating value. Okay? Realize, most of the people who care most about what the end thing you build is don't know how to code, and they don't care about how fancy or how intricate your code is. Okay? To the extent that you follow best practices, conventions, are because you may have colleagues or people you have to work with who will benefit from being able to have code that's more readable, and the user experience may benefit from code that is more optimized for a faster application. But how you achieve a faster application, the end user doesn't care. If the code is readable, other people on your team can work with you. Okay? But remember, like, who your audience is. Okay? Who is affected by the choices you make, and you will make better choices. Okay? My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Please do join the Slack and Discord community over there at devnursery.com. And subscribe to the YouTube channel, because I've been putting out a lot of YouTube videos. Go check out my blog regularly, either on dev.to or over there at alexmercedcoder.com. Putting out articles at least once a week, usually with some sort of fun tutorial or some sort of really useful fact. Lots of great articles to read in the past. I try to create very evergreen content that, even as technology updates, should still be very relevant and help you understand a lot of things that are worth understanding, especially if you're a newer developer. Okay, at the end of the day, you're not a web developer, you're not a data scientist, you're just a developer. You find solutions. You may have areas where areas of expertise, but remember, when someone wants to hire you, someone wants to, as either as an employer or as a client, you're there to solve their problems. You're there to solve whatever it is they need a solution for. And if you remember that, you'll be successful. You'll do well. If you think, hey, I'm just looking for people who are willing to pay me because I know some things, then that's going to be very difficult, because then you don't know why they would hire you, and they don't know why they would hire you, and that doesn't really help anybody. So you got to realize, what is the problem that I'm solving, and always remember, you're always aimed to being able to be a better problem solver by growing your skill set. But yes, I think I've ranted and done my whole Tony Robbins-y thing enough. I'll see y'all later on the next episode. Have a great day and enjoy.